We're just a couple of minutes past 4. Let's get cracking. Welcome. I think we have people from around the globe today, so that's always really exciting. Thank you for joining this webinar. It's part of our series of webinars in 2021, our Snack and Learn webinar series. We're really excited to talk about today the work that we've been doing in the realm of biodiversity net gain and well-being. Today, this will be a 20-minute webinar. We'll have 10 minutes of question and answers at the end. In the meantime, please familiarise yourself with the GoToWebinar control panel. There you can add your questions in the questions box, and we'll endeavour to get through as many as we can in that question and answer session at the end. The presentation will also be available in the handouts box in the GoToWebinar platform, so do have a look at that as well. All right then. Hello, I'm Hannah. I'm a principal ecologist at WSP. I'm also working in the area of biodiversity net gain, and I'm a biodiversity net gain lead for the UK. I've been working in that area for about 3 years, and I'm lucky enough to be joined today by Julia Baker from Balfour Beatty. She's also been working in this area much longer than me. So grateful to have her here today. Biodiversity Net Gain lead at Balfour Beatty. So together, we're hoping to give you a bit of a view from the consultant and contractor, as we are, in this webinar, where we'll talk about a bit of work that we've done on a scoping study. The study was regarding biodiversity and well-being. It was a collaboration between the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management, the University of Oxford, World Business Limited, Balfour Beatty, and ourselves, WSP. It was funded by the Esme Fairbairn Trust. So with that bit of an introduction, let's carry on. A little bit of context first. So why are we talking about this? Well, here we have one of the 17 United Nations Sustainability Goals. This one's number 3, good health and well-being. Increasingly flying up our agenda, and it goes without saying, we've had the year, or the 18 months of all 18 months, the pandemic that we've been unfortunate to be affected by is an illustration of the effects to human health and well-being as a result of environmental degradation. And of course, reversing environmental decline reduces threats to human health and well-being. So in this webinar today, we're keen to focus in particular how nature affects our well-being. So well-being is a term that we can get into. It might be one of the questions later. But we're particularly interested in this effect of nature, the nature's contribution to well-being.
So Hannah, can I jump in then? So nature's been pretty important during the pandemic, do you think, in terms of our well-being?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it'll be really interesting what everyone here thinks, but certainly personally, nature's been massively important to me. I was in lockdown, like many others, very fortunate to have a garden outside, and that garden just helped me so much. I wasn't a gardener, now I'm a gardener. And I was really interested to see, actually, has any of this been underlined by any studies? And actually, I did find that the Mental Health Foundation found that spending time outdoors was actually a key coping mechanism for people with the stress of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the UK, about half of people, that's 45% of people, noted that visiting green spaces such as parks really helped them to cope during this time. So nature has been really helpful to us during this pandemic, and there's this other really nice stat here that was taken from the thick of that pandemic between April and June 2020, where 85% felt that just being in nature made them happy. So even pandemic aside, we know that spending time in a natural environment really improves mental health and feelings of well-being. It reduces our stress, fatigue, it combats loneliness, and it's a really good way of binding communities together. So
I guess, Hannah,
yeah.
you know, we're talking about the importance of nature to our health and well-being. But this webinar is about biodiversity net gain, so that's that link between development and nature, I guess. Could you take us through what is biodiversity net gain exactly?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've mentioned this term a few times now. There'll be people here who've never heard of biodiversity net gain. So yes, put simply, biodiversity net gain is an approach to development that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than before. And we love this little image where it's pretty easy to see that once you've built your development, hopefully what you're going to do is put back whatever was there before and better, some more. So yeah, it's hopefully a new process, a way of doing things where development can actually be a force for good for once, where actually real improvements can be made in the surrounding environment. And so as an approach, it should include developers working with local planning authorities, wildlife groups, landowners, other stakeholders to support local priorities for nature conservation. And it should be implemented in a way that applies the 10 good practice principles. So there are actually international principles around as well. We're going to talk about the ones that apply to the UK. So if I go on to the next slide.
So these were developed quite specifically for the UK, and like you said, there's international principles on biodiversity offsetting, but what are these principles for us here in the UK then?
Yeah, so these have been drawn by international work, a lot of international work done by the Business and Biodiversity Offsets Programme. We've drawn on this, so these organisations here, there's the Chartered Institute there again, which I mentioned before. There's CIRIA, that's a research body for construction in the UK, and there's IEMA, which is an Institute for Environmental Management Assessment. They've brought together how these might apply in the UK. There's 10 principles. As you can imagine, they focus on biodiversity. There's one principle in particular, however, principle 3, which says be inclusive and equitable. This principle is the only real link that brings people into the picture when we're talking about the biodiversity net gain process at the moment within these principles. However, it doesn't mention well-being, and it doesn't look at the impact of biodiversity net gain on well-being. It only really does focus on biodiversity.
I think that was the gap that we found, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
We have biodiversity net gain, we have these principles, and the only social element in the principles is, well, engage people and involve them. But what about the impacts? We know that being in nature is fundamentally important to our well-being. So if we are changing nature for biodiversity net gain, how does that affect someone's well-being? And that's what we wanted to test with this study. And
can you tell us a bit more about that, Julia, the scope and the purpose of the study?
Absolutely, and it wasn't just a gap that we recognised here in the UK. Internationally, there was a look at whole of biodiversity offsetting and net gain internationally, and that was a conversation that was happening internationally as well. It's like we will never truly deliver biodiversity net gain as part of a sustainable development approach if we don't consider the impacts on people. And I certainly believe that it's when you look at sustainable development, you can't isolate everything, you can't work in silos, it is the whole picture. And to isolate biodiversity net gain without considering people isn't in line with the direction of travel that you've just talked about, particularly for the sustainable development goals. And I think this is quite interesting, isn't it, Hannah? Because in England, we've got the Environment Bill coming.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So there's a particular interest, especially now in the UK, there's a whole load of momentum. And this is because this biodiversity net gain process that we've been talking about is going to come into effect via this Environment Bill. So we're expecting this bill to become an act kind of at the end of maybe this year or maybe early next year, possibly early next year now. This will mandate all development to use biodiversity net gains, so all developments will have to be assessed in terms of their biodiversity losses and gains. And there'll be a particular target as well. So the bill will state, or the act will state, that the development should be aiming for a 10% net gain. So the question there then is that actually there's going to be a lot of development going on with this BNG approach. Is there a potential risk here if these developments are poorly designed because they don't take into account people's well-being?
So we wanted to explore that. Yeah, exactly. In terms of our study, because we're still fairly young with Biodiversity Net Gain here in the UK, particularly looking at the Environment Bill coming in England. So if we don't lock in the social aspects now, it's going to be much harder down the line. And this isn't about lessening the ambition for Biodiversity Net Gain, not at all. It's just making sure that we're not negatively affecting people and we are maximising the benefits for people as far as possible while delivering those Biodiversity Net Gain outcomes. But when we started this study, Hannah and I, you and I, kind of the biodiversity folk, and we're like, right, okay, what are people doing already? So are
right.
existing social impact assessments already capturing the full extent of objective and subjective elements of people well-being? Because if they are, then great. We just need to knock on their door and rope them into our biodiversity net gain assessments. But when we began to explore that, certainly, looking at the existing requirements, looking at what is already happening in practice and then coming into policy, there certainly is a gap. So while the international narrative and while the narrative here in terms of sustainable development is about well-being, the term well-being is used all the time, when you come down to it, the social impact assessments do not capture well-being in the terms that we're looking at. And often they're kind of undertaking in a very siloed way between, okay, you've got your different boxes of an impact assessment, and it really takes the professionals working on it at a piece to really make those close collaborations and those close calls to look at the fuller picture. So we kind of delved into the world of social impact assessments, and it wasn't enough for what we wanted. It certainly, there's a missing piece there, looking at the narrative and well-being and saying, well, actually, we don't do that as part of development, and there's a piece.
Yeah, so I suppose we've got Bristol here, don't we, on the slide? And Bristol's one of the very few local planning authorities that is quite explicit about how well-being should be considered. It says the impact of development on human health and well-being is a material consideration in the determination of planning applications, and that's great. And there's a lot of local planning authorities with policies that did have, as Julia said, references to well-being here, there, and everywhere. But in terms of the tools used and the clarity of how that should be approached, that was most definitely unclear. So in the UK, perhaps people are familiar more so with environmental impact assessment, but there's also this way of assessing impacts on health, and that's just simply called a health impact assessment for about 152 local planning authorities that we looked at. So that's about a third of the local planning authorities in England. That was our sample size. The only real tool that was used in relation to any kind of assessment on wellbeing was this health impact assessment. And we did find that where that was used and where that was required was also patchy. So, for example, HIA might only be applied to developments of a certain size or developments of a certain type. If it was particularly thought to be perhaps hazardous to health, maybe a mining development, for example. So there wasn't anything that we felt consistently across the board addressed how well-being should be assessed. That was really interesting. So with that in mind, yeah, there's clearly kind of more to do here, wasn't there, Julia? So can you tell us a bit more about where the study took us next?
Yeah, so there's a gap. There really is. Biodiversity Net Gain is moving forward, but with a strong biodiversity focus, and we're going to miss something if we don't consider people. There's a gap in policy. We've got the shining star example of Bristol, but not the strong policy requirements, and there's a gap in the assessments that we do. So we realised, though, that when we're looking at joining the dots between biodiversity net gain and well-being, we have to start right up at the top there. So right at the top is what we're talking about. This is the true sustainable development, when we do have people's well-being as an integral part of sustainable development. To get there, though, it is absolutely clear from the work that we've done that we need to improve existing social impact assessments to better incorporate objective and subjective elements of people's well-being. Now, we're not saying that's easy by any means, and we worked very closely with Oxford University, who've done a lot of work on this. So there's knowledge and experience within the academic world that we can draw on to do that, and running alongside, absolutely, is the need to build capabilities and skills in those wellbeing impact assessments. That needs to happen. That really, really does, because then when we come into our world and biodiversity net gain, we can make those links. You know, we can make that much better interface between social impact assessments, wellbeing, and biodiversity net gain. Then we can say to people, look, you're doing a social impact assessment on people's wellbeing. We're just interested in people's wellbeing related to biodiversity and that change that happens under net gain. So that's our little bit in your big wide world of sustainable development and wellbeing. And we need to do that in a way that doesn't lessen the ambition of net gain. It's still true to that the ambition and the goal and the drive that, as Hannah said right from the start, development is a driving force for good. But we do need to consider the impact on people. And at the end of the day, it fundamentally is underpinned by much greater collaboration between social and biodiversity experts. So when we started off this study thinking, right, we're doing biodiversity net gain and we really need to consider people's well-being, we unpacked a much larger picture and a much larger context in terms of, well, where are we? And I think it's particularly relevant as we come out of COVID-19 and people are talking about the green recovery. I haven't had clarity on what that actually looks like. And I think we need that. We need to get bold, we need to get ambitious, and we need to fundamentally think about people's well-being when we think about sustainable development.
Yeah, and this slide is really like a nice slide that kind of fits where people's relationship perhaps will be between biodiversity net gain work and how we try and cater for people's well-being in general. We've got this lovely part in the middle where, you know, people really enjoy biodiversity as well as it making them feel good. So what does the study tell us about what's needed next, Julia?
I know, right? It's all very well-being. Let's get bold and ambitious. And you and I have day jobs, and it's like, where do we go from here? And I think there's so much that we unpacked in the academic world, and just actually within in industry, about people are exploring and understanding much more, not just in terms of well-being, but how to assess it and how to analyze it. And we are building up the evidence and the experience with biodiversity net gain as well. And we started net gain at piloting. You know, we that was the industry focus and the government back in the day. And I think it's the right move for us here and now, because while the biodiversity net gain, the legislation, the policy is marching ahead, what we need to do in industry is really unpack what this would look like. So it is taking the knowledge and experience from the academic industry about how do you assess well-being as part of an impact assessment, and do it in a very practical way, bringing that back down to, Hannah, what you and I are interested in, people's enjoyment and use of biodiversity, which is essentially people's relationship with nature, and then going through the impacts of biodiversity net gain and how we work with there. So we went through this study and we unpacked, we got the compass direction, but we also unpacked quite a lot of questions in terms of how do we practically move forward with this. But we also discovered a whole lot of tools out there, a whole lot of tools that we can use in terms of moving forward with pilots. So we are really keen to explore this. Our next stage is going to pilot biodiversity net gain and the wellbeing aspects. And certainly, Hannah, I don't know about you, but we'll certainly be interested in partnering up from here.
Yeah, absolutely. We can't wait to kind of make this, see how this works in reality. So this is kind of maybe a good point actually to possibly take some questions. Actually, we've got questions starting to come through. So I'll maybe start with the one at the top that I have here, Julia. Do you think that recent changes to the National Planning Policy Framework, including the National Model Design Code, might help bring more focus on health and wellbeing in planning?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, so for international people, we did recently have a revision of the planning policy framework that put into place, these design aspirations. To me, it was a smaller step than I thought we could have done. So I think it's a step in the right direction, and possibly, sometimes you need to change in small steps before you. Sometimes a big leap is just too much. So maybe I'm being ambitious. I would say yes, it is a step in the right direction, but it's only a small step, and we would certainly need to do more, because we are very good at working in silos, and breaking out of that, and leading to a better place when it's more integrated, is a bigger change. So yes, a step in the right direction, but no, it's not enough.
Brilliant. At this point, I'll just put on our webcam so we can say hello as we answer your questions. We got into them a bit too enthusiastically there, so hello. So I wonder if there's a few more questions we can take. It'd be really good to know what you guys thought of it. I've got one for you, Julia, because I know that the study looked into this. So what definitions did you look at when you looked at well-being? How did you define well-being for the study, the scoping study that you did?
Yeah, so well-being comes in parts of the objective side, and then there's subjective side. So there are objective elements of well-being, which are typically measured, such as health, age, all the factors that underpin well-being that feed into, like education, things like that. But then there are subjective elements such as relationships, feelings of worth, satisfaction, happiness, anxiety, depression, those kind of things, your social networks, feelings of purpose. And there's many academic studies that have actually got together quite a comprehensive way of looking at those and being able to gather information across the board. And I think what was quite interesting is that they range from, like multiple questionnaires to multiple choice. And when we were running through that, thinking, well, what can we use here in industry? There's definitely a middle ground between, very highly complicated academic studies, and when we're talking to Oxford University, the willingness to get quite practical with these aspects, make sure that, we are an industry, we're not running an academic exercise, that we can really, really nail those down. But when you're looking at people's relationship with nature, it's important not to just say, well, if you visit nature, then you'll get better physical health, but to look at these subjective elements as well. And finding the tools within the academic world certainly helped with that.
Brilliant. And was that work able to also give us an idea of how well-being should be measured? Because obviously we're talking about nature having this impact on us, it must be measurable somehow. We saw those stats. What did we find out in the study about measuring well-being, how we would do that?
You know what? It's exactly the same as when you ask people about measuring biodiversity. There's that initial, no, you can't put a number on biodiversity, but we need measurable outcomes, right? And it is in recognition of using proxy indicators, which means that you need a wider understanding and a wider assessment. We can't put a single number on nature, so we have a measurable outcome alongside a host of other assessments to really gain the full picture. There's certainly assessments where you can have a quantifiable approach to well-being, but so long as you have the context to go with it, so you understand what the story behind that.
Brilliant. There's another question here. It's great. It says, sorry, it's me again. Hello, me again. Interested to know if health and well-being and the link to nature is addressed better anywhere beyond the UK that we could look to for best practice. That's a really great question, actually. I don't know for myself, there must be.
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, Julia Jones has done some great work with the social impacts of biodiversity offsetting. So if you're interested in, particularly in biodiversity offsetting, check out Julia Jones. It's Madagascar or somewhere like that. It's all a mining, and she looked at what are the impacts on people. When people lose biodiversity at the development site, and then there's an offset further away. So a different group of people benefit, and the losses and weighings and things like that. So there's certainly work that is saying knocking on the door saying it's really important to consider people when you do biodiversity net gain. You know, you can get a net gain outcome that might be fine for ecology and for wildlife and following the good practice principles. But if you are changing nature and you are influencing and affecting different groups because of your development site and then your biodiversity offset site, you'll have winners and losers with people, and that might not be okay. You know, we have to test the bar in terms of what is sustainable development and how do we get there.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was interesting that kind of that last slide. The study did raise things about capabilities and perhaps who it would be that would have to determine or make that assessment. What did your study kind of bring out about who should be doing these roles?
Oh yeah, and I think, you know, when we talked about this, so we talked to so many people, and people very generously gave their time, and every ecologist, rightly so, and I shared this saying it's not my job. You know, what are you talking about, the social stuff? You know, and it really isn't, and that's that collaboration piece. As you know, someone who's working on biodiversity net gain, I can raise this, and I need to raise it. And we need to say we need to consider the impacts on people, but then that is finding, you know, and joining the dots with people working in that social impact world. And it's also to make sure that we are being proportionate and practical. You know, if it's a barn conversion, we don't need a full-blown wellbeing assessment. If it is a major project where you're building major infrastructure, crossing rural areas, urban areas, and you're having an impact on people, then that will be something you need to consider. So absolutely, you know, and I think there's so much that we need to do in terms of, you know, as we move forward with sustainable development, it is the whole picture, and biodiversity net gain and wellbeing is certainly going to be part of that.
Absolutely, and especially at the moment, you can imagine if folks here don't know how the biodiversity net gain process works. Part of the process is that you look after these habitats that you create from when you're offsetting, looking after those for 30 years, beyond 30 years, looking after these habitats for as long as is possible, really. So presumably, if we don't have people's well-being in mind and the people that are affected by these projects, then how are we going to build that legacy, that biodiversity net gain legacy? How are we going to keep those habitats going all that time?
I think that's a really interesting point, because when we're asking people saying, you know, do you think actually this is important? You and I do, and you know, we're involved in the study. So many people actually said yes, because we won't do biodiversity net gain without it. You know, if you're looking long term, if you're looking 30 years down the line with biodiversity net gain, if it doesn't have that close connection with the people living and working there, you know, if we don't draw in that people connection again in a way that doesn't lessen the biodiversity ambition, we'll never have that longevity. You know, we'll never have that duration. And even if the money's ring fenced, even if you've got a great design, even if you've got a great management plan, it still relies on people connecting with it, you know, and really wanting that biodiversity and that nature in place. So it became moved from I think we need to do this because it's important and part of sustainable development, to, gosh, this is actually an essential tool in the toolkit, you know, to get successful net gain.
Absolutely, that's certainly, I agree with that wholeheartedly. We do have another question, but we are at time. So I'm going to say, if you leave that with us, we will try and get an answer back to you. In the meantime, there is the handout. Please do have a look at that. Thanks everybody for attending. We do hope it was insightful for you today, and that you'll go and have and find out for yourselves. Maybe you want to try a pilot. That would be great. And yeah,
just a final word. So please do get in contact with Hannah and myself if you are interested in this, even if you just want a discussion and take it forward. We are going to be moving ahead with pilots, and the reports will be up on the website pretty soon. So we'll certainly post up web links to everyone on there as well.
That's right, and that will be the CIEEM website, won't it, Julia? The Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management here in the UK.
Absolutely, yeah.
All right then. Thank you guys. We will leave it there. I hope that you've enjoyed the session. Do join us again for one of the next sessions.
Thanks, Hannah.
Thank you. Bye.